Right now, millions of people are sitting in front of their computers thinking everything is normal. They turn on their PC, open a browser, check email, maybe launch a game, maybe edit a document, maybe watch a video, and they assume the machine they've trusted for years will continue working exactly the same tomorrow. But what most users don't realize is that the entire Windows ecosystem is quietly approaching one of the biggest turning points in modern computing history. And no, this is not some Hollywood-style shutdown where screens suddenly go black and governments take over computers overnight. The real danger is slower, quieter, and honestly far more effective. Because what's happening now is a transition that could permanently lock millions of users into hardware restrictions, cloud dependence, forced AI systems, subscription ecosystems, and security policies they never agreed to in the first place. For years, Microsoft dominated the desktop world because Windows felt open. You could install what you wanted, upgrade when you wanted, ignore updates if you wanted, build your own PC, customize the interface, run old software from 10 years ago. But over time, something changed. Windows slowly stopped feeling like software you owned and started feeling more like a service you temporarily rented. Every major update brought more online requirements, more telemetry, more Microsoft account integration, more background AI systems, more ads inside the operating system itself, and more pressure to stay connected to Microsoft's ecosystem every second your computer is running. And now, users are hearing phrases like end of support, unsupported hardware, mandatory security requirements, and AI-powered future. Most people ignore these words because they sound technical and boring, but behind those phrases is a reality many users are only beginning to understand. Your computer may still physically work, but the freedom you once had over that machine is disappearing fast. Microsoft officially ended support for Windows 10 in October 2025, which means no more standard security updates, no more free support, and increasing pressure to move users toward Windows 11 and newer AI-focused systems. Microsoft support. And for millions of people, upgrading is not simple. Some PCs are considered too old despite running perfectly fine. Others fail Microsoft's hardware checks because of TPM requirements or processor limitations. Entire systems that still perform everyday tasks smoothly are suddenly labeled obsolete by software policy rather than actual capability. That's the part frustrating users worldwide. It's not that their computers stopped working, it's that they're being told their computers no longer deserve support. Imagine buying a car that drives perfectly, only for the manufacturer to tell you the roads ahead are now restricted unless you buy a newer model with extra sensors and cloud connectivity. That's how many longtime Windows users feel right now, and this is where Linux enters the conversation in a massive way. For years, Linux was seen as the operating system for programmers, hackers, and tech nerds who spent their weekends typing commands into terminals. Average users stayed away because Linux felt intimidating. But something incredible happened over the last few years. Linux distributions became polished, fast, visually modern, beginner-friendly, and shockingly powerful. Distros like Linux Mint, Zorin OS, Ubuntu, and Fedora Linux started targeting normal people instead of only developers. Suddenly, users could install Linux and immediately browse the web, edit documents, play media, run games, and even use many Windows applications through compatibility tools. And while Microsoft was adding more cloud integration and AI services into Windows, Linux was moving in the opposite direction. More privacy, more control, less tracking. No forced accounts, no ads inside the operating system, no hardware lockouts telling users their PC is too old to exist. That contrast is becoming impossible to ignore. The so-called May 20th lockdown people are talking about online isn't a literal shutdown date where Windows stops booting. It's symbolic. It represents the moment many users finally realize the old era of personal computing is ending. The era where your PC belonged entirely to you. The era where software stayed offline unless you wanted internet features. The era where updates improved your system instead of changing how you use it without permission. Today, modern operating systems increasingly want persistent connectivity. They want cloud synchronization. They want behavioral data. They want AI integration. They want ecosystem dependency. And companies justify all of it through convenience and security. Sometimes those features genuinely help users. Sometimes they improve workflow. But they also centralize control in ways the average consumer rarely notices until it's too late. Look at how quickly AI became embedded into operating systems. Features once considered optional are now deeply integrated into search, screenshots, file indexing, productivity tools, and system recommendations. Companies claim these systems make life easier, but critics worry about privacy implications, local data analysis, cloud processing, and long-term dependency on AI-driven workflows. Once AI becomes the center of the operating system, removing it may become nearly impossible. And this is exactly why so many tech communities are urging users to learn alternatives before they're forced into decisions later. Because switching operating systems after a crisis is hard. Switching before the pressure arrives is much easier. Right now, millions of users are procrastinating. They keep saying the same thing. I'll deal with it later. But later usually means when something breaks, when an update causes issues, when support disappears, or when software compatibility changes overnight. And at that point, panic replaces preparation. What's fascinating is how fast Linux gaming evolved during all of this. A few years ago, gaming was the main reason most people refused to leave Windows. But tools like Proton and major investments from companies like Valve Corporation changed everything. Suddenly, thousands of Windows games became playable on Linux with surprisingly good performance. The launch of the Steam Deck proved something massive to the entire industry. Linux was no longer just a hobbyist system. It could power mainstream gaming hardware successfully. That moment changed perception worldwide. Developers started taking Linux more seriously. Hardware compatibility improved. Drivers improved. User interfaces improved. Tutorials exploded across YouTube. Entire communities formed around helping ordinary users migrate away from Windows. And honestly, many users who finally switched were shocked by how smooth the experience became. Older laptops suddenly felt fast again, boot times improved, RAM usage dropped, background bloat disappeared, updates became smaller and less disruptive, and maybe most importantly, users regained the feeling that their computer belonged to them again. That emotional shift matters more than people realize. Because technology is deeply personal. People spend years on their computers. They work, learn, communicate, create, and relax through these machines. When users feel manipulated by software decisions they never asked for, frustration builds slowly over time. And Microsoft knows this frustration exists. That's why the company constantly balances between innovation and user backlash. They know aggressive changes can push people away. But they also know most users stay because of familiarity. That's the real power of Windows, not necessarily superiority. Familiarity. Most people don't switch operating systems because switching feels scary. But history shows platforms can lose trust surprisingly fast when users feel trapped. Look at what happened with internet browsers. Years ago, one browser dominated almost everything. Then user frustration grew, alternatives improved, and suddenly the landscape changed. The same thing can happen with operating systems if enough people feel their freedom is shrinking. And to be fair, not everyone should immediately abandon Windows. Some users rely on specialized software unavailable elsewhere. Some industries require Windows compatibility. Some people genuinely like Windows 11 and its features. And that's fine. The point isn't that Windows suddenly became unusable. The point is that users should understand the direction computing is moving before they become completely dependent on systems they no longer control. Because once ecosystems fully lock in, leaving becomes harder every year. Files become cloud dependent. Workflows become account dependent. AI assistants become embedded into daily habits. Hardware becomes certified around specific software requirements. And eventually, users stop asking whether they own the computer at all. That's the future many critics worry about, a future where the operating system becomes less like a tool and more like a controlled service layer sitting between you and your own machine. And honestly, some of the signs are already here. Modern PCs increasingly ship with AI hardware branding. Entire marketing campaigns now revolve around AI assistants integrated directly into operating systems. Features that once required explicit activation now arrive enabled by default. User interfaces increasingly encourage online accounts over local accounts. Even basic system setup sometimes pressures users toward cloud synchronization before they've even reached the desktop. Again, companies present these changes as convenience, and sometimes they are convenient. But convenience always has a trade-off. The trade-off is usually control. That's why privacy-focused communities, open-source advocates, and longtime Linux users have become louder than ever. They believe this moment is bigger than just Windows updates. They believe we're witnessing the transformation of personal computing itself. And perhaps the most ironic part of this entire story is that Linux, the operating system once mocked as difficult and irrelevant, suddenly represents something modern users deeply miss: simplicity, ownership, and independence. No forced ads in the start menu, no mandatory Microsoft account, no hidden telemetry systems collecting endless behavioral data, no AI assistant integrated into every corner of the desktop unless you choose it. No hardware lockouts telling you your perfectly functional PC deserves retirement. That message resonates with people, especially during economic uncertainty, when users don't want to spend money replacing computers that still work perfectly fine. And this is why searches for Linux distributions keep rising every time Microsoft announces controversial changes. People are exploring alternatives not because Linux suddenly became trendy, but because they feel pressure building around the future of Windows itself. The next few years will likely define the future of desktop computing for an entire generation. AI integration will accelerate. Cloud systems will become more deeply connected to operating systems. Subscription models may expand further. Hardware verification requirements may tighten. Security architectures will become more restrictive. Companies will continue arguing these changes are necessary for modern computing. Maybe they're right. Cybersecurity threats are real. Malware is evolving. AI-generated attacks are becoming more sophisticated. Companies genuinely need stronger defenses. But users also deserve transparency and choice. That's the balance everyone is fighting over right now. Security versus freedom. Convenience versus control. Cloud integration versus local independence. AI assistance versus privacy. And somewhere in the middle of all this, ordinary users are simply trying to decide what operating system they can trust for the next decade. So when people online talk dramatically about a Windows lockdown, understand what they actually mean. They're not talking about one magical date where computers stop functioning. They're talking about the gradual realization that personal computing is changing fundamentally beneath our feet. The shift is already happening. The question is whether users prepare before those changes become permanent. And for many people, preparation simply means learning alternatives, while they still have time and flexibility to do it calmly instead of under pressure later. Download a Linux distro in a virtual machine. Test it. Explore it. Learn how modern Linux actually works in 2026 instead of relying on outdated stereotypes from 10 years ago. Because even if you never fully leave Windows, understanding alternatives gives you leverage. It gives you options. And options matter more than ever in a world increasingly built around locked ecosystems. The biggest mistake users make is assuming the future will look exactly like the past. It won't. The desktop wars are evolving into something far more complex than Windows versus Linux versus Mac. The real battle now is over ownership, data, AI integration, and control over the devices people use every day. And maybe that's why so many longtime tech users feel uneasy right now. Deep down, they sense the industry crossing a line. The computer is no longer just a machine sitting on your desk. It's becoming a permanently connected platform tied to identity systems, cloud infrastructure, AI processing, behavioral analytics, and subscription ecosystems. Some users are comfortable with that future. Others absolutely are not. And the divide between those two groups is growing wider every month. So if you're still sitting there thinking this conversation doesn't matter, consider how quickly technology changed over the last decade alone. Smartphones transformed from optional gadgets into extensions of human life. Streaming replaced ownership of movies and music. Cloud storage replaced local archives. Social media reshaped communication itself. AI tools are already transforming education, programming, art, and business. Operating systems are next. That transformation is already underway. And for millions of users, this may genuinely be the last comfortable window to decide what role they want Windows to play in their future before the ecosystem becomes even more deeply embedded into every part of digital life. Maybe you stay on Windows. Maybe you upgrade to Windows 11. Maybe you switch to Linux. Maybe you build a hybrid workflow using both. But whatever you choose, make the decision consciously instead of waiting until circumstances make it for you. Because once users lose the habit of controlling their own machines, getting that freedom back becomes much harder than anyone expects.